Hello again. I have had occasion to visit two National Health Service hospitals in the last few weeks, once with somebody else and then yesterday on my own account. The less said about Whipps Cross Hospital in the London borough of Waltham Forest, the better. Yesterday I was at Moorfield Eye Hospital, which is supposed to be the best for eye problems in England. I don't actually have anything wrong with me other than some lesions which needed to be checked out around my eyes. It's nothing significant. The thing which struck me about the people at Moorfield who had appointments, though, was the same thing which I saw at Whipps Cross a few weeks back. This is that the patients sit in rows and the staff act as though they are beggars or paupers being seen as an act of charity. There is no sense that these people are the ones who have paid for the doctors and nurses via their tax and national insurance contributions, that in fact the medical staff are working for us as we are paying them. It put me in mind rather of a workhouse where a lot of poor people were lining up to receive charity. There is something very wrong about this idea, and it creates altogether the wrong atmosphere. The feeling one gets is that the doctors are mighty lords, the nurses are their servants and guards, and that we peasants will have to wait and see if they will be good enough to do something for us. We are treated as though we are petitioning a favour which may or may not be granted. An indication of this mentality may be seen in the way that patients are kept hanging around as though their time is of no value at all compared to that of the doctors. This appointment of mine was not at an A&E. These were all people who had been given appointments at certain times at a hospital, and yet an information board warned that the average waiting time was 2 hours. No realisation that those waiting there had lives, that their time was important. They were just expected to sit there, humble and grateful for being offered any kind of service. The only people whose time mattered was the doctors. Of course, an alternative is to go to a private hospital, but that can be even worse. BBC's Panorama programme did an expose a couple of days ago of a network of private hospitals to which the NHS sometimes send people. At one of them, doctors were contracted to work 168 hours a week. I can't afford anyway to use private hospitals, but I have seen the situation in them. When my mother died a few years ago, she was lucky enough to have insurance with Bupa, and so was able to die privately rather than on the national health. She had a room of her own rather than being on a public ward, and in that room there were carpets rather than lino and tasteful prints on the walls. Also, you could ring for room service. It was like being in an hotel. Before we got in there, she had been at King George Hospital in Ilford, and once she was moved to the Bupa place, I was astonished to see some of the same nurses attending her there. You see, they were all moonlighting at the private place to make extra money. They were working shifts back to back, so they would do an 8-hour shift at King George and then come to the Bupa hospital and do an 8-hour night duty there. You can imagine the state that they were in at the end of 16 or 24 hours continuous work. The same thing was happening with the doctors. The same doctor was attending her there as had done at King George, because he too divided his time between the NHS and private work. But anyway, it was a pleasant place to die, and convenient for the family too. We could all sit round there in that room, sit around the bed watching the dying woman, and it was very comfortable. I realised when my mother actually died why I would not wish to be treated in such a place, though, if I were ill and hoped to recover. This is what happened. I was alone in the room with my mother when she died. I saw no need to notify anybody, because I'm perfectly able to see when a person's pulse stops and they stop breathing. I knew she was dead. After sitting there for 15 minutes or so, I wondered if I ought to tell somebody what had happened. But first, I checked through the chart on the clipboard at the foot of the bed, just out of interest. I knew what was killing her mind. It was then that I received a most tremendous shock. The chart showing my mother's temperature and pulse had been filled in for the next couple of hours. In other words, although it was 1:15 in the afternoon and she had by then been dead for 15 minutes, according to her chart, she would have a normal pulse and temperature in an hour and 3/4 time. Clearly, the staff hadn't realised she was so close to death and decided to save time by filling in a few details in advance. I said nothing about this, but after the doctor had confirmed her death officially and I'd been out of the room, I came back and found that the later entries in the chart, made supposedly after she was actually dead, had been Tipp-X'd out. I'm bound to say this rather gave me a bad feeling about private hospitals. I'm pretty sure that however bad the NHS establishment, they wouldn't be pulling tricks like that. I don't know what the answer is to this. The NHS is utterly appalling, but I think if I were genuinely ill, I would sooner trust myself to the NHS than private medicine.